Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polity's podcast. I'm here with Alex Denley.
Hello.
Hi. Hello, Alex. And we are here to discuss Joseph Ratzinger's The Unity of the Nations. Why? Why would we discuss such a book? Well, it's pretty simple. We're having a conference. The conference is called Our Kind of People. May 29th, May 31st. You can still get your tickets right now. And we're discussing the issue of the people, the question of the people. Are we a people? Is there such a thing as the people? Are you racist if you believe in people? Does the church need us to be a people in order for us to become the people of God? Such questions occupy our minds. We stay up late at night and think about them.
Oh, totally.
No sleep at all.
It's causing me a lot of lack of sleep. I'm trying to figure it out.
It's terrible. Now, one of the things we did is we just read, and you can look at this podcast right now, Joseph Ratzinger's The Meaning of Christian Brotherhood to get a little bit of a beginning, where he basically discusses the idea that the church forms a brotherhood in the world that does distinguish, and this is the controversial part, it does distinguish between an inner and an outer and prioritizes the inner. If you're a brother to a Christian first, this is a real, factual, Eucharistic relationship. It's not just airy-fairy, and you in fact live it out. But unlike the various pagan brotherhoods of the world, what we might call the sort of insular brotherhoods, both in modernity and of the ancient world, the brotherhood of the Christian faith has a universal transcendence to it, right? Mm-hmm. It's always moving towards a universal brotherhood, right? But it hasn't already achieved it. Rather, it has it and it does not yet have it. It's oriented towards it through the conversion of all people into the one church. What's the church? The church is the reform of humanity. The church is where humanity goes to get right. Yep. And so to be there, to be brothers in the church is to prioritize the brotherhood over everyone else, and at the same time to work for everyone else to become brothers. Mm-hmm. It's a dance, really, between the particular and the universal, but it's a dance, darn it, that the church is doing and been doing for 2,000-something years.
And one way to put it would be that the church is the people in right relation with God. And I think Ratzinger talks about it in this book, that when you're brought into the church, you are the people of God. And what that means is in right order and in justice towards God. Yeah. And so you have to be brought into that, which is just the Christian doctrine of original sin, that we're born not in right relation with God.
Yeah, but the question then is, this people that becomes in right relationship with God, what about it? What about the prerequisite for joining the great Christian brotherhood? What does it mean to belong to a people that then belongs to the church? This is more what's discussed in the book that we're going to discuss right now, The Unity of the Nations, where nations and peoples are pretty much the same thing, especially in the ancient world. There's a distinction in modernity that we can sort of talk about. But the reason we called our conference, the reason we're excited to invite you to this thing in Steubenville, Our Kind of People, is because, well, being a part of a people fills me with warm, happy feelings.
Yeah, totally.
Like if I go into a bar and I see my people, I'm like feeling really good. Mm-hmm. These are my people. They're the people whom I am comfortable with, right? Augustine says at some point that a man would rather hang out with a dog than with a foreigner. I'm not a dog guy. Augustine was, so we have that distinction. But I think we can all appreciate, at very least, the positive, right? The feeling of complete comfort with your people who know you, who speak your language, where language isn't just understood as the raw English, but the fact that the words you use, the references you have, the stories you have, the history you share, the traditions you share, the expectations you have belong to each other. Like you hold each other in trust.
Right. I mean, it's an essential definition of home, which is
being home.
My people.
Your people. That's right. And it's
and at every scale. It could be your physical home, it's your family, and then it could be your hometown. These are my people, this is where I grew up, whatever. Yeah. You have all the stories, all the relationships. This is my homeland, you know, you this is my home state. Yeah. You know, and it grows in those different orders. It's
a beautiful thing. People are ashamed to say this because they feel like they're being parochial, particular, and sometimes even racist. But you know what? I think it's a wonderful thing to walk outside your front door and say, darn it, the women of Ohio are the most beautiful women in the world, right? Because being part of a people, as a sort of necessity, places you in a relationship of not being those other people. Yeah. Now, it's the basic presumption of modernity that the only possible relationship is one of hatred and violence to those other people. Like to say, I'm not you, can only be somehow a way of hitting someone in the head with a baseball bat. And you would if you could. But that's just not how this works.
Just because your town has the prize-winning cow doesn't mean the other town deserves to be killed.
Think of it from the very beginning, right? Yeah. I'm not a woman, for instance. But can you imagine the negation being anything but a joy? It's like the fact that you're not someone, right, allows you to be for them, right? The principle of communion, right, the idea of loving each other, depends first on not being each other. Because if we're just each other, right? So if, for instance, within the relationship of sexual difference, we're just an androgynous mass, right? Then there isn't a possibility of love if men and women are not actually different, such that one negates the other and says, I am not you. Then to love a woman, or for a woman to love a man, is just to love themselves, right? It's just to sort of engage in the same kind of homogenous relationship that you already have with yourself, because you're saying that, well, that's not actually different to me. We're really the same.
Right.
It's an imperialism. It's deeply unsexy, right? Whereas with the people, there's belonging, but then there's also not belonging. But that relationship, I don't think, de facto brings like hatred, violence, and negation, right?
No.
It's also the precondition for love, the precondition for communion. But it's a paradox, because also is also the precondition for hatred, right? So I'm not trying to say that this is simple.
So if we could say the primary difference is male female in this way, and the primary reaction of that difference is both a little bit of trepidation and fear of the other,
Totally.
but also just a natural inclination of love.
Totally.
Where it's, wow, they are different,
right?
But and this is a fundamental. And this can tell us about differences among people. That
right,
this is present in every people.
Because what the boys do when they get together is they make fun of women. And what the girls do is obviously make fun of men. Like, this is what they do. But they marry each other. Now, it seems to me the same relationship could apply to the United States and Canada, right? Where people want to say, oh, you can't make fun of Canada. That's basically this elitist position, this sort of like, the glories of empire allow you to make fun of Canada, but really, like, you're basically quasi-racist. No. I say making fun of Canada is the prerequisite for loving Canada. And equally, I would hope that if Canada can make fun of America, then we can recognize each other in the very difference that's required for us coming together into one great nation. I don't know what we're doing here. I don't know what we're doing with Canada. One great nuclear power.
Yeah. I mean, you saw it at they just had a big international hockey thing, the Four Nations. It was awesome. But, tensions are high right now because of,
I get it.
Tariffs, threat of tariffs,
That's right.
The whole thing, 51st state, which, very funny. But they had their hockey match and Canada booed the U.S. anthem and then 3 fights at the beginning of it. And it felt like a moment of international harmony when they were just like duking it out. I know. It was just like we grew in the respect of the other.
The problem with liberals is that they're not men. Like, they have no balls, is what I'm saying. What I'm saying is they look at fights, they look at antagonism, and all they can see is something dirty and scary. And they're like, well, we can't have this. Like, what we have to do is get along, which means that like there's no conflict. But if you look at anything that makes life enjoyable or fun, it's the ability to risk conflict because you're actually accepting and dealing with people in their difference, right? The liberal, and this is something that Ratzinger discusses in The Meaning of Christian Brotherhood, sort of presupposes this sanitized unity and then demands that people submit to it and then denies that he's doing that. So he says, like, we're all one. We all belong to this common brotherhood. We have this universal human rights, this universal human dignity, and we're all the same deep down. So if there's any kind of conflict, then it's this just absolute like horror, like people are denying the most fundamental truth of their common humanity, right? Whereas actually, I think fighting is always the same. It's the same. It's the other side of the coin of love. I'm not trying to be like pro contentious marriages or something. I just mean that the ability to say you're different, I'm not you, you do things I don't like, I find you odd, we don't fit, your customs are strange, right? All of this, which is the prerequisite for fighting, is also the prerequisite for allowing the other to actually be him or herself, which includes the nation, right? The other nation. It's like, no, I don't understand you people. You are odd to me. Like when I love you, it's an actual act, right? It's not this presumption that like, oh, well, none of that stuff matters. Mm-hmm. And so I love you because you don't matter. It's like, no, I love you and I find you odd, right? Yeah. Which seems to be more like the marital experience. Like as you continue in marriage, it seems more and more likely that you're going to look at the one who is not you and say something to the effect of like, I deeply, passionately love you and I don't understand you. You're weird. And this just seems to be how love works.
Instructive for also understanding how
difference is difference is difference. Okay, you can't understand the peoples without understanding the marriages that produce people. Like these are not just like, oh, they got a difference over here and a difference over there. It's like, no. Peoples come from men and women, right? Like That's what happens. Okay, we're a little far afield, but we wanted to do that because we wanted to clear the ground for the idea that difference is both good, but not simple, right? That it's actually messy and dirty and involves the possibility of hatred and violence, but also involves the possibility of great unity and love. I think the church is the place that is most willing to risk difference, to say the other can belong without sacrificing all that makes them particular because they're involved in one thing, the worship of Almighty God in the one church. But that's going to take some understanding. That's, I think, what Ratzinger's up to. I will say, reading the Unity of the Nations, if you wanted an argument for the peoples just being bad and needing to get over all that particularity and just join the church where they can become one thing, I think Origen is who Ratzinger deals with in the first half of this book is going to be your guy. But I think that position, and I think Ratzinger also thinks that position, is incomplete. Necessary to understand it, but incomplete if we imagine that the role of the church is to quash the differences in the peoples in order to create a sort of homogeneous church state, if that makes sense. So maybe we could get into that?
Yes.
Okay. So, Origen, our guy, thinks some odd stuff, but darn it, he's holier than you, so you're going to have to deal with that. Here he is. Sorry, I'm flipping my pages here. So basically, Ratzinger describes his particular theology of the angels of the people. And the way that you can maybe understand this is with the beginning premise that division is a result of sin. So Augustine, explaining the kind of patristic background, says that sin appears as a mystery of division. Thanks to its workings, humanity's original unity was shattered into many pieces, that is, into individuals mutually opposed to each other. Right? The mystery of Christ, which abolishes sin, was consequently understandable as a mystery of reunification. And he goes into how several fathers think of this. What happened in the nature of one human being in Adam and his sin affected the whole. When God became man then and drew a particular man to himself and thus into union with God, he thereby touched the human beingness of all men, and with that this entire organism, all of humanity, was moved towards God. The human beingness of Jesus Christ was, as it were, the divine fishing rod that caught the human beingness of all men and was now pulling it in, so that all the human beingness of all men would be brought into the unity of the body of Christ, the God-man, and out of the fatal division that characterized the isolation known as sin. And I think this is true, first of all.
Yes.
Like, sin divides. It divides people from people. You can look at this, like, phenomenologically in your life and know that it's true. Like, when you sin, you know that you are alienated from your neighbor. If you really want to achieve the state of sovereign individuality, I would advise just shooting someone in the head, because you will suddenly become alone in your sin, right? Which is what the existentialists basically worked out, that like sin, if we are in fact individuals, then true authenticity is just true alienation, and true alienation comes from shooting that Arab guy on the beach, right?
Until there's no more people. Yeah.
So, okay.
You will never be the sovereign individual.
So that's the one way, but you can also understand it theologically in the sense that we have a story that of the fall, of original sin, where man in his unity in the original human family, by disobeying God, Augustine says, invents for the first time the private domain. So God gives him a law in which to live with him, with God and man living together in the garden, and with his neighbor, Adam and Eve. And when he breaks the law, Augustine describes it as writing a law unto himself. So he's giving himself a new law as if he's the lawgiver. But also, tellingly, separating from Adam from Eve, Adam from God, faking, as it were, a sort of individuality, as if I don't belong to you, I don't belong to God. This is a sort of the nature of the first sin, is to be divided from a whole, to pretend to be a part when you're not a part. You belong. So I think either theologically or phenomenologically we can say, yeah, sin is a division. It's a division of humanity. And Origen takes this further. Say, you wanted to read?
Yeah, I was just a comment on that. It brings up the idea of the two Adams, right? So that the former Adam, because of sin, and then being scattered, led by the Archons around, it's that the body of humanity is broken. Is broken against itself. It's not unified. And that the two Adams doctrine here, and this is drawing on Romans 5 primarily, that part of what the church is doing is through God becoming man and assuming all of what is human in his person, then what the church is doing is reconstituting Adam, is bringing us into the new Adam.
Oh, it's so awesome.
Into the new creation. And so that's the way you view the division of the nations, is under the scattered body.
Let's back that up a little bit, because that comes with Babel, which is where Origen goes next. That idea that you brought up in the Fathers, Ratzinger discusses from Augustine, where the letters in the word Adam, I'm forgetting, it must be in the Latin, maybe in the Hebrew, but they stand for all four cardinal directions: north, west, north, south, east, west.
Yeah.
And he interprets this symbolically as meaning that just what you said, that the first Adam is scattered all over the world and then reunited in the one Adam. So the peoples are a phenomenon of sin. And that's, I think, the idea that becoming an individual people is the result of sin is really the troubling idea that's very clear in our fathers, like in our tradition. And it leads to this question of like, well, what are we saying here? Like, there's just the nations are just wicked as nations, and then they only become redeemed by sort of dropping the particularity, their division, the us against them of nationhood. Well, I mean, what Origen says is what you intimated, that the sin of Adam recapitulates itself in further generations until you get to the story of Babel, where man sins, erects a tower in pride against God in order to have a city of his own. And God punishes them for their pride and for their sin by changing their tongues, so that original unity, which was signified by oneness of mind and a singular language that existed prior to the fall, which Augustine thinks was just Hebrew, gets divided into many tongues, so that man can no longer discourse amongst men, and that each nation is led to each linguistic group that God creates is led to a different part of the world to be a nation. And Origen describes this as being placed under the care of essentially a demon, a rebel angel, what he calls an Archon, which has its connection to the Gnostics. Now, a quick background for understanding what's going on here. In some ways, Origen is trying to make Gnosticism orthodox. So what I mean is The Gnostics, I'm going on a really great text by Hans Jonas here, which is sort of a classic for understanding Gnosticism, wanted to separate the idea of the God of the Old Testament and essentially critique him as really being a evil God who is over the world, and separate him from a God who is not of the world, who does not really have discourse with humanity as this higher level being, right? And making our earthly existence a sort of matrix. The movie, The Matrix, where what we perceive as being the good creation of God is in fact a prison, right? Is in fact a sort of evil world that the enlightened one begins to understand as being a crooked game, an evil world, a bad prison, and is able to break out, right? And essentially by escaping the body and escaping the world, attain gnosis and salvation. And there's a lot more to it than that. So I think in some ways when Origen is saying, okay, no, he wants to retain the unity of the Old Testament, the New Testament, of the God of the Old Testament, as it were, with the God of Jesus Christ. He's refusing the Gnostic split, but he is saying that, okay, no, but there are Archons. You're just wrong that they are the quasi-creator of the world. They're, in fact, the angels of the nations, the rulers of the nations, the ones who trap you in something, but not in the world. They trap you within national identity. They are the spirits of the air by which you are led to believe that the unity of your national life, you're a Hittite, you're an Egyptian, you're a Scythian, is it.
Right.
And the customs, which in fact are evil, which are sinful for Origen, are the true laws of nature. And the religion, right, which in fact are false in the worship of idols, are in fact the true religion, are in fact sufficient. And that other nations are just enemies.
Yes.
That's the basic logic of Origen.
You're not seeing that whole arrangement as God's punishment upon you. Like, you've forgotten that God has sent the Archons to then lead you to these lands because you didn't go out and fill the earth, and instead you have gone under the trap of the Archon. And this is where there's a debate that Ratzinger brings up between Origen and the Hellenist Celsus. And Celsus says, well, in my cosmology and the view of the world is that the lower gods, are ruling over all the peoples.
Yes.
And Origen says, yeah, of course they are. But
Yes.
the one God did that. He set the Archons over all the peoples as a punishment because of Babel, because they tried to unify, and now the church is here to bring about that actual unity among the nations.
Right.
Like God is the main actor who's like acting in the world.
Yes.
Through the Archons.
Totally.
And Celsus doesn't have that. He just has that the horizon is limited there. You can't see that God's acting in it.
Right. He says that the problem with Christians is that they're pretending not to be a particular cult. The problem with the Christians, he says, Celsus to Origen, is, he says, I would like to ask them where they come from and who the author of their fatherland's laws is. They cannot produce him. So they have no fatherland. And this is really the rebuke of Christianity, that the order of the world and peace itself relies on the nations having no universal sort of transcendent aspect to them. Relies entirely on each person submitting to their God, to their customs. And Celsus is fairly enlightened. He says, okay, maybe there is one supreme high God, but you worship him under the aspect of your particular nation. And so the problem with Christians is that they're basically men of no nation. They are, and he thinks that's a scam. Like, no, you really are. He calls them fallen away Jews. He's like, you're just bad Jewish people. And because of this, your universality is fake. And you're totally right. Origen's response to this is no. All the gods of the nations are demons. They're Archons.
Right. And Augustine's solution to that problem then is to say that the homeland is in heaven. Like, we are citizens of a city.
Yeah.
But that city is nowhere on earth.
Yeah.
And we're awaiting the resurrection and the coming of the New Jerusalem and our heavenly homeland. And so this then relativizes all national claims to be everything.
Totally.
This is our homeland. But guess what? We all die eventually, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
Augustine's very clear. Like, death is the, should, even in a natural sense, be the definitive curb to idolatry and believing that your nation is, the final thing. We just can't see the resurrection until Revelation. But then when Augustine says that this earth is not everything, we have a heavenly homeland, that then relativizes all national claims to this ultimate, we are the ultimate homeland, custom, religion, everything in our nation, and we are supreme. That just doesn't work anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I really like about Origen's discussion is how well it accords with the feeling of Christianity being a liberation. It's freedom from the Archons. And this is obviously, it's the book of Ephesians, or letter to the Ephesians, but it's also, it's just the story. Like, Christ comes to set us free from the power of the evil one, and he makes new political reality possible because we're free now. We're free men. But the idea of it as Christian conversion is the rejection of the bad angels who would trap you into national identity, and then the taking up of essentially what Origen would call like a true commonwealth, the true commonwealth of heaven. And this is why for Origen, there was just not a lot of patience with a kind of what we might see as a more middle ground sort of participation in the life of the nation, that then you are sort of spiritually, though, hedging a little bit by being a Christian. Like, for Origen, you couldn't join the military, for instance. You couldn't support the empire in that way. And so there's a sort of, which totally makes sense. Like, you can't just help the Archon create a stronger national identity like that. You have to defeat the Archons, and that's what Christ enables you to do. Okay. Wow. So I think all of that's basically true, but then it does lead to a difficulty, right? What do I think is true? Well, I do think it's true that it's just obviously true, and maybe even more apparent to us in the modern age, that national identity is used as a tool to destroy everything that's universal and transcendent in man. The actual rise of what we call nation states in modernity might be more instructive than trying to speculate on the inner disposition of the Hittite, in the ancient world, right? Like, in the actual construction of nation states, you had a unity of Christianity and of Christian nations that were different, had different customs, and then in order to create a strong army-producing nation, you had to unify, you had to destroy local languages, local cultures, local law, you had to homogenize and bureaucratize to create a centralized sovereign state. And the very idea of sovereignty, which, we go into in different places here at New Polity, but the very idea of it is a being sealed off from any universal order, where the order of the nation, the customs of the nation simply are natural to the people who are benefiting and who belong to that nation.
And in addition to that, there is a conscious effort to resurrect the Archon. I think in a certain way. There is an effort to find the Geist, find the Volksgeist, find the...
There's the spirit of the Ergon.
You have to... the nation... It's almost like you're trying to resurrect what Christianity has dispelled of Archons in the demonic sense, where it's very clear. You're looking at Egypt, and it's like, there's some demon angel above it, and there's this whole cult, and then there's Pharaoh. And then we get to the modern nation states. It's like they've been constituted according to Christianity for so long that by the time they're trying to bring the people into this one mass with a setting up a cult to France or to Germany or whatever, you have to then bring back that spirit. And there's so much with nationalism. There's this real close tie with this spirituality and spiritualism and the pagan gods and whatever. And in a sense, they're trying to resurrect what used to be the primary way a nation constituted itself under an archon.
Yeah, totally. And I think in some ways Ratzinger Ratzinger is the only member of the Hitler Youth to ever become a pope, right? And so I think in some ways, it's true. In some ways, I think this is his response to Hitler. And really his whole papacy, I think, is a response to Hitler. So he has an obvious sympathy towards, keep that archon dead. Mm-hmm. Because he lived through the oppression of a nation that wanted to have the Geist
resurrect the archon, man.
Wanted to get that Volkswagen, everybody in. And so he says, Origen says, or rather Ratzinger, when he's sort of summarizing Origen, he says that this liberation needs to be maintained, this idea of liberation, but that there's another part of Origen that doesn't really get developed, but seems to suggest another reading where there's something in the nation that's not just completely given over to sin. There's something there that is preparatory, he says, for the coming of Christ. And he describes this as very similar to how Paul speaks in Romans about the law, that basically the difference between the modern nation building project and then the sort of pre-Christian nation is one of naivete. The nations prior to Christ can be described as performing a certain function, right? When God divided the nations, it's with the plan of bringing them back into unity, right? So there was a certain good, you could say, of, instead of the original humanity being destroyed, of it being spread out over all the earth. But that good is precisely for the sake of it being brought together into the miracle of unity, right? Mm. Like Paul speaks in Ephesians, there's a mystery that's hidden in God from all the ages, and it's that the Gentiles, that is the nations, are co-heirs along with the nation of Israel, along with the Jews. And that this is the mystery that God performs before the face of the Archons. Mm-hmm. This is the letter of Ephesians, before the Archons, and shocks them, amazes the powers of the air, who could not believe that this happened. They thought that they had this sort of quasi-peaceful distribution of all humanity into nations, and then to see that they belong together once again, right under their noses, is the ultimate gotcha moment that Christ effects. Mm. And so Origen does give a sort of preparatory, a nod to the preparatory power of nationhood, of the peoples, but then very clearly and with a really harsh line says, but now that Christ has come, to remain a nation is sin, unequivocally, without naivete. It is simply to reject the unity Christ has brought and to remain a entrenched holdout of disobedience and pride against this new thing that God has brought into this world, this new peace, this new marriage between nations into the one church that's made possible by grace. And it's that's so obviously true about modernity, right? If you look at the unifying efforts of Napoleon to be a nation, if you look at Hitler, if you even look at Bismarck, if you look at any of these guys, and darn it, if you look at our sweet, beloved homeland, I have to say that we're kind of doing the same thing, although it's weird because we whatever. America's weird, to be honest. But it's obvious that it's a spirit of rejection of the universality of the church. The rise of the nations happens, it is the same thing as giving up on the universality of Christendom and giving up on kings and monarchs in obedience to the spiritual power of the church, for instance. That's just historically true. So I think all which to say is Origen, I think, is totally right, but it cannot be the whole story.
No, right.
And the reason is I'm just going back to that bar and looking at my people, whoever they are and however you feel it, and saying, there's something good here, man. Like, there's something about this difference that is not the others, but belongs to you prior to your unity within the church that seems like a good.
Right. You don't want to deny the naturalness of humanity and difference. At the same time, you say there's something to be purified in nationhood.
Totally.
Now, if it's a complete negation, which seems to be, if we hold these things in tension, then where there's a negation of something that is nationhood, and there's something good that of nationhood, Origen definitely falls on, no, Christianity is the negation of nationhood side of it. But I think that goes, like you're saying, it goes too far. There is something good and natural to being a people that still has to be recognized and brought up into the church. It's when Christ says, go and convert the nations, presumes there are nations and there will continue to be nations. This is the way that the peoples have been apportioned upon the earth. And if you stay with where Origen, it will tend to just, this negating atmosphere of Christianity, just destroying the notion of peoplehood.
And God bless it, but the wisdom of the East tends towards imperialism. I mean, this is just historically true. In a very similar way that its take on sexual difference, if you look at the Greek fathers, tends towards androgyny, tends towards this idea that maleness and femaleness are somehow a result of the fall, and that in Christ we have the sort of healing of this original wound of difference back into a sameness. Like that's which some of the Greek fathers profess, the sort of androgynous Christ, then definitely moves up the various levels of difference to sort of the idea of an imperial church. Where Augustine takes some issue with this, it's obvious in his reading of the scriptures with the story of Pentecost that if Origen was correct, then you would expect the story of Pentecost to be a little different, right? You would expect that when all of the nations come into the one church, we call it, so my mother would always call Pentecost like the church's birthday, right? So it's when the church starts to be in a certain way, which is true. And you expect when this church comes to be that the results of division would be annulled. And what you would experience would be all of these different people speaking now one tongue. Because remember the story, right? The story was that there was one family of Adam, and they spoke Hebrew. And then because of sin, they were given diverse tongues and lands. And then in the reunification, they belonged to one nation, the Father of whom is Jesus Christ, one holy people. So you'd expect that if this was the whole story, they would all be speaking Latin. Or maybe Church Slavonic, or maybe Greek.
That's very interesting
but that's not what happened. Just to finish, the story of Pentecost is not that, but it's that there is the comprehension of particular different tongues. So when the apostles speak, everyone understands them in their own tongue. They're not understanding a new language. They're not losing their own particular language, but are in fact experience something where their own language is comprehended and comprehensible in this one phenomenon, this one outpouring of the grace of the Holy Spirit. Right. So that would suggest that the retention of national difference in the one church, in a way that your Archon, it would, if you were going to sort of think of it in Origen's terms, you would want to say, hey, maybe we were wrong that all there was were the bad angels, and maybe every nation had a good angel and a bad angel. Maybe there was a war from the beginning for the soul of this particular people. Anyways, something like that.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, just that, in Acts 2, and they were all amazed and wondered, saying, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in his own native language?" And then it goes through the list. It's always fun on Pentecost Sunday when someone tries to go through, Medes, Elamites, and mispronounces it. But
where the Medes at?
Yeah. But that they hear in their own native language. Because you can imagine them saying, hey, we all hear it, and it's all one language, and we all understand it.
Totally.
Right? It's like, no, that's not. We actually, the Spirit allows us to hear it in the different languages.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, like, isn't it Saint... like the different missionaries to the different countries, one of the first things they do is translate scripture and the liturgy into
Cyril and Methodius, baby.
Cyril and Methodius, that's
yeah.
what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Into the language of the people that they go to. It's one of the first missionary efforts is to make the gospel intelligible in the native tongues.
I know. I'm just becoming more and more of a vernacular man. I think Vatican II really was a new Pentecost. That's my most contemptible opinion today. And Augustine takes this further in some way, but he also really naturalizes. Like when Augustine asks the question, okay, so how is it then that the wounds of Babel are healed? He points to the actual historical mission of the church to all the nations. He says, what happened there at Pentecost was a miracle, but it wasn't a miracle that was supposed to be repeated. It was a miracle that prefigured the church in its eschatological completeness. So right now, we're going to experience something miraculously that will be practical and just real as the church converts nation after nation. He says all tongues are spoken in the church because all nations, if they're not Christian yet, they're going to be. This is Augustine's view of things.
Wow.
And that's this goes back to Ratzinger's emphasis on the unity of the church being a fact, not this idea of a common humanity, not this presumption of a universal human dignity like the Stoics had and like the moderns try to replicate. Not that. The actual fact of eating the bread together, the fact of Eucharistic communion, the fact, as Augustine will say, that over in India, they are eating the body of Christ, not at the negation of what they're speaking in India, of their particular land and their custom, right? But the fact of their real participation in the church. And this is where Ratzinger speaks of the kind of the unity of the church in the one bread being the image that becomes most relevant. Okay.
Yes.
So where does this all leave us? I mean, one of the things that I think we have to do is go back and look at Babel again and ask ourselves, is the story as simple as we might take it? Because it seems to me that it's just more true to our experience to say there's something so deliciously great about belonging to a people. And there's something in the church that says, not only do you say you get to keep this, like, I don't want it to sound like you Mexicans can keep your avocado, your guacamole and such, but that's all become sort of basically irrelevant spices on what's fundamentally you're just Christians now. And I don't think that. I think it's actually in fact a deepening of their particularity to belong to the church because it makes it intelligent. We'll talk a little more about that. But if we look at the Babel story again, at least the tradition, which granted is a little scattered on it because it's not showing all its cards as far as the Hebrew text is concerned. There's another way you can look at it. Abram is called out of his nation. And it's a pretty consistent tradition that he's called out of the leadership, the kingship of Nimrod, who's the architect and builder and king of the Tower of Babel. And what Nimrod does is try to appear as a god to men. So you have in this story a kind of original take on nationhood, which is that used in a certain way, it is a tool for the production of divinity by man. Which, of course, you go fast forward to nationhood later, you got Martin Heidegger saying the same thing, like we have to be able to produce another God. That's what Christianity has essentially made impossible to us, and that would be the true like renewal of things, is the ability to produce another God. Okay, well, that's what's happening in the story of Babel. So out of that idolatry, Abram's called. Now the story goes on, and the people who are migrating east decide to build this tower. Now, what the rabbinic tradition, what the Jews said about this, was that there's a sin here. The sin was against marriage. The sin was against the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, which we often say that. Catholics are very good at remembering that. But what we forget sometimes is what happens next. Fill the earth and subdue it. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And the rabbis focus on that fill the earth part and say, this is the disobedience of the generation of Babel. They refused to fill the earth and instead said they would stay in one place. Okay? Now, this has immense theological implications, right? Because if you can stay in one place and refuse, not let anyone leave, and they also took this, intellectually speaking, they took this as not letting anyone have a different philosophy, making sure everyone was of one mind. Well, if you can produce that, what you can produce is sort of a fake world, right? Where the men really can appear as the God of that world because you've essentially bracketed out the real. So there's a story, it's a medieval story of Abram under the kingship of Nimrod, who learns, he doesn't know about God because Nimrod's God, but he learns about it by looking out of the city to the stars and to the moon and to the sun, and he realizes Nimrod couldn't have created those, and so it's a sort of, it's quaint, but it is a conversion story. But if the tower is a sin against the commandment to fill the earth, then we have to look back to what marriage actually does. What does procreation actually do? What does love actually do? And it strikes me again and again that love makes people. Now, I mean this literally. Like, that is where people come from, is the love of man and woman. So, yes. But it also makes people in the sense of love over time makes people particular. This is obviously true when you're raising a child, right? Like it or not, you are making that kid weird. Like, that's sort of part of parenting. Is like your dad was an almost opera singer, and you like Debussy, and that's just going to be one of your things. That's who you are. Praise God. But just look at love. I mean, when a man and a woman love each other for more than like 6 months, they start to develop a language that's distinct between themselves. Just the nature of belonging to each other does this. And it would be awkward and embarrassing for another person to understand or to be brought into that language, right? It shuns the outside. You think about the sexual act itself. So the act of making people, Augustine notes with great glee that it always seeks the dark, seeks the darkness. It seeks to be alone from others. And I know this is going to sound weird, but I think you have a certain core of nationhood there because it is creating an us that is not of them. And the presence of them would be a horror to the us that's present in the nuptial act, right? But that is the act that brings people up, that brings people that cooperates with God into bringing new people into the world, is this isolation of the us. And if you, as a family develops, as more people come into it, it becomes more and more weird. It becomes more and more particular. You develop your particular customs, your particular stories. You have, like, the nickname is a really good phenomenon. Like, names that belong to the family aren't appropriate for other people to use. Like, we used to call my brother Jambo. I don't know why. We used to call my little sister Onion because of the little thing on her head. I think most people had an onion in their family. But those names, those kind of words for each other, they belonged to the logic of love. And you can imagine, without sin, without presuming the fall, peoples, by virtue of loving each other in this way, becoming more and more distinct, right? So as the family of Adam spreads out, not because of any sin or violence on their part, but because of the very logic of love, they become particular. You're letting me rant. I really appreciate this. Another obvious way.
Go for it.
Another obvious way is land. So land is distributed because people love each other. What do I mean? Well, when you're just you can wander the face of the earth. But when you marry and a woman she dares to risk becoming pregnant, then you need a place, right? Because you cannot be pregnant and you cannot give birth as a wanderer. Like, you need to, at least in that microscopic regard, stay. So a place becomes for you. And then as you have children, as those children grow up, you particularize the place so it suits the customs of your family, and it becomes different. It also, in a real way, becomes yours because justified by being removed from the common lot by virtue of serving the love that you're about. So it's not the fact of like arbitrarily declaring this spot yours. It's that there are children here, that you are doing something, you're using the earth to raise people up. Mm-hmm. And in that raising of people, you're not shutting out the world. You have a universal tendency precisely because those people become marriageable. I'm being a little bit crude, I suppose, but because those people become capable of being for others. So your sort of particularization, you might say your nationalizing of your little plot, you're becoming a nation over and against other nations who have no right to take your land, is in fact justified by the work that love does, which is to make people capable of serving other people. Mm-hmm. You can imagine over time the family of Adam spreading over the earth and becoming truly unique and even incomprehensible in certain ways to, the other family over time. And that none of this involves sin. That none of this is division, and it is division, is the result of the rejection of one common humanity. Mm-hmm. And in fact, love demands it from the very beginning. That isolation of the us is demanded by the very nature of love from the very beginning. Okay. So, if that's the case, then the sin of Babel, the sin of Babel can't just be understood as the first moment when mankind decided to be different, as if what you had was just homogeneous big family Hebrew, and then there was some kind of sin divisiveness. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So if you look at the text, they move to one place together and decide not to fill the earth anymore, mm-hmm. right? Which is to say that they desire to contracept the production of difference. And the stories that the rabbis tell about it are very explicit. Because they decided to stay in one place, they had to manage the population, and so they had a furnace in the heart of Babel where you burned children, where you offered up your sons and daughters in sacrifice, because you had to prevent the natural procreative reality of moving outwards. You had to kill people. Mm-hmm. Right, in order to keep the population to one that could exist within the tower. This was the sin of Babel. I mean, again, it's a medieval tradition, but it has its roots in a more ancient one. Bereshit Rabbah. Okay, so they stay in one place. They reject the multiplying, differentiating command: fill the earth and subdue it. And instead, they are subdued under a mortal king. So when God punishes them, God comes down and sees what they're doing. It's not like the height of the tower that's the concern. He's just like, man, if they go a little higher, they're going to poke heaven. Yep. Although that's another rabbinic thing, the idea that they had an idol at the top with a knife in its hand to kill God. Mm. But I think that's an important story to hold at the same time, though, because the idea that... I'll just be brief on this. Like the differentiating reality of procreation is humiliating to any pretensions towards divinity, right? Because when you see that people are very different, the one thing you know is that none of them are God, because all of them have a particular and finite slice of reality, as it were, and so can't be the sovereign thing, can't be the supreme thing. It's like, no, this is a family with a particular thing. So it is true that the production of divinity is the goal of the Tower of Babel. I'm just saying that the production of divinity or killing God can only happen through killing difference in man, because only when man is not this particular and particularizing force in the world can he ever appear as divine.
You could put it another way. Only you have to have knowledge in order to have power. And so if the peoples are spread abroad, then it's hard to know them, totally. Which is part of the reason why the ones closest to you naturally love, because you know more of them. Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully you love them. But if all the peoples of the earth are spread and then multiply, and the natural diversity and natural loves are there, then God is the one who can who can see the whole and organize it. But then it's like, well, we can't do that.
Right.
I mean, Now with our surveillance state, maybe we could start
Well,
to do
but
it
no,
with
it's
the internet.
it's
But you
not,
know what I mean? With Babel,
yeah.
like I need to literally see all of you. You know, you need to be within Shinar.
Totally.
And then let's destroy all that potential diversity that would only allow God to govern it.
I know.
And now let's do it, you know. Here.
No, that's brilliant. You're totally right. You're totally right, Alex. You're right. God is the one who can comprehend the sort of infinitely diversifying families of the earth.
Like he can unify it as far spread as it goes.
Yeah.
He still knows the whole.
Yeah.
Right? But man can't.
Yeah.
So we have to be able to see it. You know, I'm just thinking always in my head, Foucault's panopticon, you know, Jeremy Bentham's
Wake
too,
up.
right? Like
Wake up, Foucault's panopticon.
You're in the panopticon, right? Like you have to gotta have someone in the middle who can see into each of the individual cells.
Yeah, totally.
That's probably what Babel was. You have to be able to see it all. And if you don't see it, then it's beyond your power. And so then you need to, so then you say, okay, we won't allow you to actually have these exclusive marriages, maybe for one, or actually know who your kids are or whatever. And we're all going to be building this thing together. Right?
Totally. Yeah. And
it's the fear of not having the knowledge to then have the power over others.
So true. And it's the fear of marriage in its leaving. So, you know, you think about the Genesis 2, the description of the whole of creation, and then it ending in this story that itself ends with, this is why a man leaves father and mother and clings to his wife. And this idea of marriage as a power that has you leave a power, right? Because father and mother, especially, you know, in the writings of Torah, you know, they're not just like mom and dad. They're also the sort of center of the clan, right? Like the power that's amassed over a man's life as he has children and the land necessary to raise them, et cetera, et cetera. Marriage is in some ways a tragic humiliation of any, if you have any pretense of that building, that glut of power being somehow sufficient, because your children leave, and they leave for love. You know, and we have all sorts of rituals, you know, from the father of the bride crying when he gives away the bride we have all sorts of rituals acknowledging that this is a certain diminishing of any amassment of human power, right? Right. And there's so many technologies implemented in order to take that procreative power, which builds up, which amasses land, which amasses obedience, and to try to put a cap on it and say it will always be mine, right? So like the harem, for instance, is a really good technology for, well, it's not really good. It's a really evil technology for doing this, where you say, no, I'm going to keep all of this procreative power. I'm going to have all the wives, all the children are going to be the princes of the one king, etc.
Right.
Okay.
It's the political power of incest as well.
Incest, yeah. It's all about incest. You know, you hate to come back full circle,
Freud.
but yeah. So this idea of not, the fantasy of not having to leave father and mother because of love. So the fantasy of a love that just turns back inwards is the fundamental political fantasy of incest. And it's what is being presumed in Babel, which is that these families will not fill, they will not multiply with anyone else, but will simply remain, will practice population control, and will have a sort of sovereign, self-contained world under a god king, which implies incest, which implies that eventually you gotta marry people that are pretty close. Okay, so all of this being said, and that was a lot to say.
Yes.
What then happened when God came down and said, this sucks and we're going to destroy it? And the angel of the Lord comes down. Well, one of the things you can see is that God in his punishment is never arbitrary. So he never punishes in a way that's not fitting to the crime, pedagogical, and merciful, because he loves us. So we got to remember this. When God comes down and sees all this human pride, he is profoundly in love with everyone involved in it. So what he does not do is just say, okay, 40 lashes, right? Though maybe they deserve that too. He says nations. Very strange, and we have to kind of understand that this is a remedial achievement of what marriage ought to have achieved. The people at Babel and the plains of Shinar would reject filling the earth. God says, good luck, and he fills the earth with them, but now against their will. The people of Shinar, of the tower, would reject the natural power of love to produce unique and diverse languages in families, God says, good luck. Now you're speaking a new language. So it's like he manually overrides humanity's natural power of differentiation and then gives them the results, and it hurts. He slaps them with the results of marriage. And so now they're living in nations which would have been the result, at least on the surface, of love and obedience to the command of filling the earth, spreading out, multiplying, subduing this place in your finiteness. That's all achieved by the punishment of God, but everyone hates it. I mean, this is the point. What is rejected as grace returns as law. And this is the story of the Old Testament. You reject a gift. You're going to get that gift, but now you're going to receive it as a law and as a whip. So you reject the power of differentiation that belongs to human love. You're going to get it back, but you're going to get it back as the nation. And the nation, because it's a punishment, is not like the nation as it would be if it was the result of grace or the result of the love of the family. Let's just put it at that. Right? Now the nation achieves the effects, right? So the people are actually saved from the tyranny of Nimrod. They're actually saved from becoming beasts, essentially, under a mortal king who pretends to be God. But because it's a remedial action that did not flow out of them, didn't flow out of their will, but was applied to them as a punishment, then the nations that they have are going to carry with it a lot of that, the lie, as it were, of Babel, the falseness of Babel, right? So now these nations do have their own language. They are constituted under sort of limited power instead of the would-be unlimited power of Nimrod, but they only have it as a state of war against the other nations, not love.
Yeah.
Right? Because God can give us all sorts of punishment and remedy stuff, but he's not going to force us to love. So he's not going to snap his finger and be like, and now you're in families that commune with each other in the one common humanity, despite, and in fact, because of your great differences. Voila. It's like, no, you're getting punished.
Yep.
The punishment is that you're at war. So every nation becomes a sort of little Babel who would make their language and their land supreme because that's the way they understand it, but they are negated by the presence of every other nation, right? So you have the sense that the result of Babel is basically like constantly humiliated polytheism. It's like, yeah, you can raise up your God, but don't shout it out too loud because you go to war, that guy might beat you and then your God's done. It's sort of like hedging, as it were, saying like, okay, there is a real danger here. Humanity in its sin almost tried to erase God from the world, right? Now, we're going to have to deal with that. But the way we're going to do that is to give them over to their sin to some extent, but in a way that prevents them from ever unifying. It's not until you get to like the Roman Empire that there's any sort of conscious like ability to imagine a violent, like the supreme violence by which every other nation could be unified because one nation finally wins out over against all others. Okay, that's the end of the Babel story. The important part, I think, is to see that I think it's a fair interpretation to see the nations as being in some way continuous with the original plan of God, and in another way, sinfully in rebellion against it. And so we can look at Origen and say, this is a man who, understandably, given the times, only focused on the way in which the nation is in opposition to God, right? But lost sight of marriage and lost sight of the natural differentiation of humanity as a product of love. Takes Augustine, who's very attuned to human love, I think, to see what we described earlier, that the particularity of the nations is not what is to be condemned, but that in the unification of the church, they bring that difference. But what's changed? Well, now none of it is mistaken for divinity. None of it all of it bows to the name of Jesus, right? So you're a Mede, you're a Greek, you're a Scythian, right? But that difference that you have has been by grace made for something greater than itself, not negating it, right? Because only a Scythian can praise God in this particular way. Only a Mede can praise God in this particular way. Only a American can offer up this particular land to God in the way that's been given to him. Augustine sort of maybe is clarified by Aquinas later. Aquinas says that, the reason for the multiplicity of creatures is that a finite creature reflects an infinite God through multiplicity, right? I'm limited. I got a limit. So how am I going to image God, right? I can't just show forth an infinity. I have to somehow have discrete repetitions of something. And then from those discrete repetitions, you build up a notion of something that no repetition could exhaust. I'm speaking very abstractly and theoretically. You can think about this with like the animals. It's like if there were just men and moles, right, we would show forth a little bit of God. But there's men and there's moles and there's parrots and there's microbes and there's just a teeming mass of things, each of which shows in its own mode a little bit of what God's like. I'm always telling kids that, like, if you think you know what God is, you just have to just look at some strange weirdo animal and remember that God made that.
Yep.
So he's a little weirder than you think. Like there's something odd there. And that idea then of the peoples in their difference are given a positive role in salvation and not just sort of extrinsically. Like, well, the sin was really bad, but hey, God's better than all that, so he's going to make good use of your sin. That's true, but it's also true that the differentiating power that's revealed in practice in the nations is itself good, because it's good for God to be glorified through a multiplicity of his creatures.
Right.
Something like that.
The difficulty moving forward with it then is how to affirm the difference of your people and affirm it in a Christian way. Yeah. Right? Like the question that you get to the end of it, and it won't, the unity of the nations is just phenomenal, but it's not going to solve all the questions. I think there are more questions that still remain. And I think that is, it being the early church. Like they're doing this in real time, right? Like the Roman Empire had created a faux unity of the nations underneath a hegemonic imperial power. Yeah. And it seemed as though you could actually unify the nations under one regime. Yeah. And when Christianity then comes, you could see then what you were describing with Babel, this unity through knowledge that gives you power, that we establish colonies here and there. We will make sure that the currency is only our currency. We'll make sure that if there's any type of little rebellion that starts to spring up, we crush it. If there's a big one, we just destroy it, and then we build an arch in Rome commemorating it, you know? So, like the Arch of Titus with the destruction of Jerusalem, like not only are we going to destroy you, we're going to make an example so that the other nations know that we have enough power to bring you back into our unity if you should try to rebel against us. Yeah. Now, Christianity entering into that, and when you have the fall, really, of the Western Empire, and Augustine trying to say, all right, did we just destroy the unity of the nations? Yeah. Right? Like that's kind of the background question in City of God. Did we just destroy the unity of nations? And so what then the question is, what is the nature of that unity of Christians being so different than that? Yeah. And how do each of the peoples remain different from each other, but then are brought into it? And none of it is it's in a completely different mode, but none of it is a simple, there's no simple, answer to the whole of it. Yeah. I mean, it's like we're a new creation in Christ. Yeah. We are brought into the one church. We celebrate the one Eucharist. But we retain those differences. And so we can't allow those differences to ever reach such a height that it destroys the unity. Yeah. The unity is prior. Right. And that's, something like that. Yeah.
And that's Augustine's conclusion in some ways. He says, speaking of Pentecost, speaking of the church in his day, today the whole body of Christ does speak in the languages of all peoples, Or rather, if there are any tongues in which it does not yet speak, it will. The church will grow until it claims all languages as its own. I dare to say to you, I speak in the tongues of all. I am in Christ's body. I am in Christ's church. If Christ's body today speaks in the languages of all, I too speak in all languages. Greek is mine. Syriac is mine. Hebrew is mine. Mine is the tongue of every nation, because I am within the unity that embraces all nations. What the Tower of Babel had disunited, the church is bringing together. Many tongues were made out of one. Do not be surprised. Pride did this. One tongue is being made out of many. Do not be surprised. Charity did this. Mm-hmm. Charity, love.
I just thought that was like Augustine's excuse for Greek, not knowing Greek.
Greek's mine. I already got it.
Greek's mine. I already got it, guys. Yeah. Don't worry about it. But no, but the point is fantastic, though, right? Like the one language expressed in the native languages of all.
It's a hegemonic and universalizing tone, obviously, that Augustine's taking, like this is mine, that's mine. But then it's also one that's liberating all of those languages that he's discussing to remain and to be themselves.
Totally. So my direct experience of it was World Youth Day. Okay. In 2016 in Poland.
Yeah.
But I went there, I was like 17 or something. And everyone's speaking different languages. Of course, it's Spanish and French and, Polish, the whole rest, but like it is the just phenomenological experience when I was there of we all have the common language of Christianity. And that I would just like go up to like random Portuguese guys and just be like, yeah, and just like make random noises, and we'd be like, yeah, and high-fiving and stuff.
Well, that's a paradox, isn't it? That I've had a very similar experience in Madrid at World Youth Day. Maybe this is God's purpose for World Youth Day, but you might think with all this that the experience would be one of like, wow, like we've all transcended our differences in the one church. But it's actually an experience of like almost brusque but profound patriotism. I'm an American, so I spend most of my time being ashamed of my country. That's one of my traits. But when you're at World Youth Day, it's very similar to like a World Cup or something, where you see all the nations arrayed, and all of a sudden you're totally proud to be an American. Mm-hmm. Not because you're like, I'm so glad I'm not Polish, right? Yeah, right? Not because I'm so glad I'm not Mexican, but to see a unity out of a diversity is a sort of a twofold affirmation. It's like, well, this unity couldn't exist unless I am particularly American. Mm-hmm. But it's a humiliation of any pretensions to like imperial pride that I might have. Because at the same time, if I go there and I'm like, okay, but we really rule this whole thing. Mm-hmm. Well, then I don't have the joy in seeing the Portuguese or in just saying like, Polska, Polska with the Poles. Bless them. So there's an affirmation of peoplehood that is, I think, only possible insofar as the people are brought into transcendent unity, because being a people needs to be for something, like it has to have an end. And I always draw the analogy to sexual difference. But the like in a marriage, for instance, like you can, prior to marriage, feel very masculine, I suppose, and you can have great fraternal communion with your sex, and you can make sort of loud grunting chants and sing drinking songs, and it's all very good and it's all very manly. But the manliness of marriage is very interesting, because on the one hand, it's a deep humiliation of all of the manliness that went before, right? Now, as a man, you're like rocking a little baby. Now, as a man, you're a servant. You're mutually submissive between you and a woman. Mm-hmm. You have... Okay, so all of this is the case. But then if you're going to turn and say, well, then it's like the loss of the particularity of being male, it would be absurd. It's like, no, like for the first time, this gift of particularity in the male sex has been revealed in its being for unity that's greater than itself. And that unity is not a negation of the maleness, but actually for the first time reveals it, because now I realize, well, this was all for something. It's like, as a boy, among boys, I could tell that part of being male in its particularity was the willingness to jump off a high thing into a body of water. Like, that was just very obvious. If you didn't do it, your masculinity was to some degree at risk. But that on its own just becomes stale if you're like, and that's who I am, I'm a jumping creature into splash water. Mm-hmm. But once you have a marriage, that ability to say, I'm going to risk death, becomes something that's obviously for others, for a woman in particular, and then for children. Like, you have to be able to risk death. And so that reality of maleness and its particularity is more deeply and profoundly affirmed by being for the sake of something beyond itself, right? And this is the great paradox, that you become more yourself insofar as you're for others. This is the whole logic of the Second Vatican Council, of John Paul II's papacy, of the idea that man finds himself by making a true gift of himself. So, like, in the giving of yourself away, you also, for the first time even, become the particularity who you are. I mean, it's a very paradoxical language, but I think it accords with our experience of things. And so, as it is in marriage, I think it is in nationhood. Like, when you become a people, there is a good there that only becomes fully revealed when all the virtues and merits and power and idiosyncrasies and language and land and customs of that people can become for the sake of something else. And then they become intelligible to that people. One of the things that we realize about peoples, and that especially liberal Enlightenment folks sort of start to fall into this trap, is the idea that the peoples are only peoples insofar as they're naive about it. So that the idea of it being lifted to the level of thought and rationality is somehow a sin against the charm of a people that are just isolated, parochial, and making their particular their particular meat and soups, and are untouched by the world. And so any kind of like being touched by others is this sort of sullying of a purity that belongs to them. Mm-hmm. This is all well and good until you sort of scratch a particular culture and find that they're like sacrificing babies or something. And you're like, well, maybe you can be parochially wicked. Mm-hmm. You can be parochially and as a people sinful and under wrath. But there's this fear, I think, of like sullying the peoples of the earth that comes from liberal enlightenment, which gains its power by pretending not to be in this humiliating posture of being a people. It's like, well, we're like the people that aren't a people, and yeah, we tend to rule the world and we have an empire over all these other peoples, but that's just happenstance. That just sort of happened. It's like, okay, what am I saying? Sorry, there's a lot to say. But what I'm trying to say is that there's no fear of that when there's the church, because who that people are is a particular development of the gift of God, and the love and the particularity that's good amongst them is the result of a profound and intense love of each other for the other. Mm-hmm. If you imagine a people that were like given the gift of spending 300 years of loving each other, now they've become so particular in that love that they look different, that they speak differently, that they have. But this is a gift. Like, in the church, and in the church alone, it's a gift that you take all of that virtue, all of that merit, all of that difference, and you put it at the service of the whole. The whole being all humanity. Yeah. And the church, for its part, is the place where those people go to be redeemed, so that you can be, it's almost like a reduction process, or maybe the biblical language would be like a refinement of metal so that only the gold remains. Like, a people contains the city of God and the city of man. The church is like the fire where the city of man gets melted out. But that gold is real too. You know, all that particularity is real too.
We're in a very difficult time for how do we unify the difference of the peoples? Because it seems like of course, the European medieval unity really was one of Christian brotherhood between the nations. And their unity and their difference was raised up into the one church. And with the Enlightenment, liberal modernity, the whole thing, there was the movement towards this faux universalism.
Yeah.
That really was imperial. And, the Valladolid debate between Las Casas and Sepulveda in Spain regarding the Indio, the native in the lands that in Latin America, of how do we extend the Christian brotherhood that we have here in Europe to this very radical other people? Mm-hmm. And how is that able to be, how are they able to be brought into that? And, partly it succeeded, partly it failed. That's a large portion of Buttiglione's book, which is going to be coming out soon. But where we are now after post-imperialism and colonialism and the fights of making a universal claim by your nation to go conquer other peoples and be supreme over it, this recovery of that we're now at a point, and I know I'm skipping to large portions of history, but we've been living under a liberal universalizing ideology for some time, post-World War II, that we're all going to be unified in a kind of United Nations. We're all one people. We all do capitalism and make liberal democratic states, and we'll all get along. And that's starting to splinter. And it's basically seen as a false way of unifying the peoples. Mm-hmm. And we're tending in a direction, like Dugin describes it, Alexander Dugin in Fourth Political Theory, of multipolar hegemonic unities, where it's this Chinese sphere of influence and American here and India and all this. But so we're in this tension between an older liberal universality and a multipolar world that's coming out of where we're at with populist movements and stuff. And so as a Christian in the midst of all of this, what is the way of Christianity to actually provide for unity of the peoples? Because it is the desire of peoples to be unified with each other in some type of way. Yeah, totally. That desire, I think, really is natural. I think it is part of the division of man, that man being divided against each other, we do want universal brotherhood. Mm-hmm. But then the question is, how do we bring that about? How do we bring about the unity of the nations? How do we, as the title of this book? And that's what we're trying to figure out. Right?
Well, light topics for New Polity.
Yeah, right.
It's probably just to get a McDonald's into every country on earth, and then we'll unify through free trade and markets. That worked okay.
Yeah, right.
No, I mean I jest, but the one of the things is that America has to recognize that if we're going to be populist, we got to go all the way, and that involves a pride and a humiliation. What I mean is that if you are a people, then you're just a people. So if we're going to say, hey, we're not just the sort of playground of a global elite that has no nations. We're a people. We are particular. We have a place. Right? You can't just flood us with immigrants because we're a non-people that you get to control. So we're going to make those kind of statements. We also have to go all the way and say, and we're not an empire either, because we also have to say we are a people just like them. Right? We can't say we can't have our cake and eat it too and say, hey, we're a people. We've got something that we're proud of, but we're also going to be in charge of a global empire where other people have to pay tribute to us. It's
totally.
Okay, but the thing that makes a global empire work is you not being just another people, but you being the divine people over whom all others are, barbarians or something. Like the actual decision to be a people is to say, there are others, and those others are good, and they're different and strange, and we're going to fight sometimes. But we're also going to love each other sometimes. And I, as an American, am a limited thing. Now, it's really hard for us to use this language because it is the language that I think the liberalizing elite have utilized against the idea of nationhood. right? Where they say, like, all of our differences are really important, by which they mean all of your food is tasty, but you are going to submit to a regime of capitalism. Like, you are going, your peasant communities will be destroyed, and we will create the conditions of scarcity by which it's necessary for all of you to contribute to a now industrial production of a GDP. And you're going to be governed by debt, and you're going to be governed by a global economic system. You are not going to have a subsistent base as your people. So it's like, you're all...
You view the world as an international shopping mall, right? They can all have their booths in this shopping mall.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
know? Look at that one. They got that one. But you're all in one big
And
thing.
we own them all.
Yeah, and we own them all, right.
No,
have fun making money.
You know? It's a very apt metaphor, because it also happens internally. Like, we have an internal colonialism of all the difference in America is constantly suppressed by a homogenous regime that would say, like the destruction of small towns for literal malls is what precedes this, where it's like, no, you can have all of your like your butcher and your baker and your candlestick maker. It's just all going to be a booth in the mall. It's like, that's great. And who owns the mall? Oh, this guy in Florida. Yeah. And another guy in Belgium. Mm-hmm. They're part of a little collective there. They're trading you all on the market. Mm-hmm. That's right. Your town is a stock. Okay, so that's just my little complaint. But it's true. I think that a internal American colonialism is also as much the problem as sort of an external American colonialism. What I'm saying is there's a humiliation that is part of the penance and part of the conversion from the sin of living like you are an Archon, that says, I am just a people, which means that I have a limited but real place and love, and that this is good and it's for the whole, and I develop it even as other places develop it, and that when we come into communion, we're governed by justice and charity, right? Communion is not governed by competition where the strong wins. That's not how communion works. That's how empire works. And that's hard for Americans because we have our imperial ambitions and our sense of ourselves as a people mixed into one, as it were, which is very evident when we look at the flag. It's like the flag flying at the baseball game and everyone singing the national anthem is principally just us loving each other, like belonging together and feeling that. But the flag, as it's been utilized, has obviously been to inspire people to die for a global empire whose interests are not particular to the American people.
Right.
So that's just sort of an example of our two minds about it. It's like we're going to have to say, yes, we're American, and we would be something good if that meant living together here, and that was it. Like, we have to be able to affirm our own goodness without our sort of success on a globally competitive stage that we both manage and compete in. It's like, that's not going to work. Which is why I think at the end of the day, populism, unless it really extracts itself from nationalism and is willing to be more parochial and smaller and to understand itself through a lens of sort of smaller units of love than the nation, will always be an easy prey for the global elite, because they'll be able to manipulate us by saying, like, oh, you love America? Well, then you should love the expansion of America into this area. You love America? Well, then you love the fighter jets, that's for sure. And you know what I'm saying? Like, there's a manipulation of our sense of belonging to a people by identifying it with our success as an empire. When actually, I think those two things are at war with each other. Right. Because an empire by its nature
I think
becomes...
at this point, the imperial is no longer fashionable to the people. Like, I think we're at the point...
Oh, I don't know about that.
Well, and I think
I go to
a different mood...
a absolute member of Der Volk in Ohio, and I say America, and just give me some associations.
But
there's going to be tanks.
Yes. But I think soon. In a different way. Like... What I mean is that it's the battle between a universalizing ideological imperialism and a multipolar
Yeah, that's true.
Influence.
Yeah.
Like I think the fashionability of invading Middle Eastern countries is gone.
Yes.
And like
Praise God.
definitively. Yeah. So even if like the guy who used to be rah to invade Iraq or do whatever is no longer that under Trump, and that type
has
of
been revealed as
imperialist.
big pansy lib.
Sure. Well, they realize that the global elites are utilizing this the structure. Okay. Now, does that mean then that the multipolar is itself a kind of internal imperialism? So let's say there's America, and then there's the countries under our sphere of influence that we narrow down, and we say, well, it's not a universal imperialism, and we allow there to be other poles of hegemonic power over its own influence. Mm-hmm. But the problem is those are inherently hostile to the other poles, right? Yes. You're hostile to the other major superpower.
This is why
you just admit that this is better than one of you guys asserting an ideological universal.
Yeah, it's polytheism again.
Imperialism, it's polytheism again. So,
no, it's
and this is why I think it's very important we have to be dealing with this question as Christians, because I think it is the case that it is only Christianity that can provide that unity of the nations.
Totally.
And without the imperialism, without also a kind of isolationism that then creates multipolar, because the fact is we're in the big. We're never going to really subtract all the way back to the lower. Mm-hmm. Like we're not going back to just this nation. It just has its individual national economy, and they just get along. It's like we're in a global order, and so how can we avoid the equal evils? Well, in different different degrees of imperial universal domination by an ideological claim of liberalism for everyone, McDonald's for everyone, shopping malls and democracy in Baghdad, right? Like, how can we get away from that, but also get away from the multipolar, hostile sphere of influence hostilities that seem to be we're heading in that type of direction? I think that it is the case that it is only the Christian brotherhood that can really accomplish that unity.
At some point, you're going to have to repent and submit to the Pope. And what I mean is that unless the relationships between nations are governed by justice and charity, by a universal that they all belong to, then this is why whenever New Polity gets on its localist kick, someone's like, well, but if we don't become an empire with nuclear bombs, then China will kill us. And that's a fair critique, because it's true that without there is no Christianity is necessary. The conversion of the nations is not like this would be a great thing if it happened. That Christ is like, go and see if this works out. It's like, because it began, it will either end in worldwide conversion or worldwide apocalypse and war. This is René Girard's point in his book Battling to the End, the last book he wrote. But what I mean is sort of what you said, like the door to a unity of the nations has been opened by Christ. And we can't close that door.
No, right.
But if where that's the actual goal and possibility because of our development along Christian lines, whether we're at a state where to do anything less than become Christian will be to tend towards a unity of the nations that's under some supreme victor, some supreme power.
Right.
It's war or Christ, which is not controversial, at least in the sense of what the Christian tradition has said about it.
Right.
But it is alarming because liberalism habituated us to this idea that we could get out of that either or. And then it's like, okay, no, we don't have to just say like we convert to Christianity and we actually believe and are charitable and good to each other, or war, where people die because someone wins. Instead, we could have this sort of dominance of mutual interests that are all sort of keeping everyone in check, just this ginormous global system of checks and balances and market relations. That was like the way that we thought we could not convert, but still have unity. It's like, this doesn't rely on anyone being good. It'll just coordinate mutual interests by a global elite that for some reason thinks peace is great.
Right. Well, it just tends to the more hegemonic power. Right.
Yeah.
Global checks and balances, but the nation that's the most powerful,
yeah, of course,
is beyond all of them. And establishes which checks and balances it has on itself. And
yeah.
So it's the tension between a national sovereignties, but now we're in a global world that has all the nations involved.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I could get on my phone and be in Dubai by tomorrow evening.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, this is just the world we live in now.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and it's the most depressing part about it is that never has Christianity been more practically expedient to people living and not just gearing up for war. And never has it been more difficult to comprehend, because Christianity cannot fit with the idea of like gearing up for national supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
Because it always bows. Like at the end of the day, it always bows. It takes all of that difference and it submits it to the thing which all of humanity is about the business of, namely the faith of being redeemed. It is a religion of penance, right? It is a religion that says we have sinned, we have fallen short, and we need to approach the throne of grace as America, as China, as Russia. And this is the idea of like self-acknowledged weakness, self-acknowledged limitation, self-acknowledged participation in a greater thing is either repellent to the aspirations of nationalism and the aspirations ultimately of global hegemony, or it's suspicious as being just a code word for more liberalism.
Yeah, right.
And so in both cases, the actual reality of the gospel, where it's like, no, this is all true. This is all true. And to be happy, this is the way, is to be particular in a greater unity, to have diversity within unity within the one church unto our redemption. That's the thing we got to convince China of, Yep. And of course, that's always been the case.
Too. Yeah.
Convince ourselves first. Yeah, I mean, it's always been the case. Why did we ever think that Christian conversion was not necessary for the peace of the world? I mean, what morons we've been, and for such a long time, that we'll just have, and Christians too, not like a bunch of atheists did this, but a bunch of like liberalizing Christians were like, yeah, we can maintain a peaceful global order through capitalism. And hey, if people convert, what a plus. It's like, no, it's convert or die. That's always been the
chapel can be in the international shopping mall too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, you go to Target.
Just put a little,
At a Target.
Maybe they walk by the chapel and like go in. And
this is always the dream, right? Yeah. This is the dream, and what we actually have is massive destabilized rogue states, terrorism, and well, it's good to be in the age we are. I think that a Christian thing is somewhat happening.
Mm-hmm.
Populism is obviously Christian. Obviously, I mean, people get offended by its grotesqueness, and I suppose that's fair if you're a fancy schmancy European. But like, it's obviously a humiliating bowing gesture before something greater. It's the desire to take on an imposed limit. I mean, that's what's sort of paradoxical about a border, right? Because it's a border against others, sure, but it's also your border. It's also your limit in some ways. And taking it on is has to be, and if it's not just a stupid farce, like a giving up on a indefinite drive for power over others.
Yes.
And I think that's what needs to be, if there's something little that we could do, is just, if we are going to be in an age of populism, then we have to conceptualize Christians. It sucks. Like I wish we could just, get on board with the zeitgeist and have no lame sort of Socratic gadfly position. Like it's not fun. Like if you're having a bunch of fun, you're probably doing it wrong, I'm afraid. But like to take up the position that reminds us that we are also doing penance in populism, that we're also rejecting a drive for power. I mean, you think about is it in James where it's like, where do wars come? Is it not from your passions at war, in your members? Where does war and fighting come from? Well, it comes from sin, and part of our desire to be a people must be a desire to do penance for pretending not to be a people, and a desire to accept an imposed limit on ourselves. I shouldn't say imposed, accept the reality of our limitations as finite creatures who are involved in something much bigger than ourselves, in order to have a country, in order to have a people. You can't have a people. I've already said this. I'm just getting passionate about it again. I should probably end this soon. But you can't have a people, right, that is at the same time denying itself as a limited reality, right? You have to be willing to let that really good desire for a limitlessness, power, and communion come from God and be satisfied in His church, because that's the only place where I think it's real. Okay, that's enough of that. Well, I don't know if we're any closer at understanding who the peoples are, but I think we've done several good things. I think we've affirmed the goodness of differentiation and saved it from the sort of imperialistic model. No problem, guys. We got your backs. Whatever you need. You call us. What do you want? We got it for you. And I think we've understood Origen without rejecting Origen. I think we've understood Augustine a little bit without rejecting Augustine. I think we've understood Ratzinger in his context as a man post-nationalism in some way, taking up the leadership of the thing that was the universal power in which all nations bent the knee but as one who has to do penance for nationalism. I mean, that was obviously Ratzinger's pontificate was a penance in some ways for National Socialism. I think that's apparent in his writings. And so I think we've achieved some goods along the way, and it's all about the fun you have along the way.
Yep.
We are proud that you are our kind of people. We are humiliated to find that you are our kind of people, and we want to see you in your peopledom, which is ours too, in Steubenville, Ohio, God's favorite little town. May 29th to 31st. We're going to have a great time. One of the things that we're very excited about is the celebration of one of our people's quaint local customs, namely an exhibition baseball game. So on Thursday night, if you're still with us, we are going to be playing baseball, New Polity versus the College of St. Joseph the Worker. I think we're going to crush them.
Oh, it's going to be great.
I am very excited.
Snow cones, hot dogs.
We're talking a country band. We're talking home runs.
Yep.
Are we going to sing the national anthem?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, we have to.
Absolutely.
We're Americans.
It's baseball.
It's baseball. It's America.
Yeah.
Maybe there should be a pie competition, too.
Oh, man.
I would love to have the pierogi race, which is the Pirates thing. Like, I really want that, because I love the pierogi race.
It's hard to explain to other people. But everyone's got something at their baseball game. It's hard to explain the pierogi race. It's like...
It's the best.
It's very particular.
Yeah. I always pick green.
Pick green.
So,
yeah. I don't know. I think that game's rigged.
What?
Yeah. No. All right, folks. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. The book is The Unity of the Nations. We're going to read, I think, 2 more books to prepare for this conference so we can sort of come with some foundation in understanding the people. I think the next one is Catholicism by Henri de Lubac. So if you have not read that brilliant work of theology, I recommend it, Catholicism. And we'll see you next time, okay? All right. Bye-bye.